기본이 필요가 없는데. 센터 페북 아이디는 없고 그 해리쌤 아이디로 로그인 하시면 된다고. 해리쌤이나 나연쌤 그 개인 아이디로 로그인 하시면 돼요. Welcome. This is Subin Cho, a project consultant of the Preparatory Office for WHIPIC, the International Center for the Interpretation and Presentation of World Heritage Sites. Pleasure to meet you all at the 2021 online lecture series on Understanding World Heritage Interpretation and Presentation. Highly appreciate you all for joining today's lecture. The 2021 WHIPIC online lecture series has been held since last April. Starting with Professor Maria Gravari-Barbas' lecture, we had a lecture with President Alberto Galandini last month. Today, we are going to have a lecture with Professor Maria Gravari-Barbas. Lectures will be held once a month until this October, and a special discussion will be held in this November. As you may know, what leads World Heritage interpretation and presentation into a more communicative, inclusive, and sustainable one is your active cooperation. So, come and join the lectures and leave your opinions and questions about the lectures and World Heritage issues on our YouTube or Facebook's live streaming videos. On the online lecture series, we have time for questions after having the lectures. Now, before we start today's lecture, I would like to introduce our lecturer, Maria Gravari-Barbas. Maria Gravari-Barbas has a degree in architecture and urban design and a PhD in geography and planning. She was fellow at the urban program of Johns Hopkins University. And she is the director of EIREST, EIREST, a multidisciplinary research team dedicated to tourism studies, with main focus on cultural heritage, development, and urban tourism evolutions. Since 2009, she is the director of the UNESCO Chair of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne University and the coordinator of the UniTwin Network Tourism Culture Development. From 2008 to 2017, she was the director of the Institute for Research and High Studies on Tourism of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne University. Her published works include a research agenda for heritage tourism, tourism and gentrification in contemporary metropolises, international perspectives, and World Heritage Sites and Tourism, global and local relations. Now, let's start today's lecture. A great pleasure to meet you, Professor Maria. I think
good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to thank, first of all, the organizers for this invitation. I'm really happy to be with you today to speak about World Heritage and Tourism, looking for synergies. The World Heritage Convention is undoubtedly one of the most successful policy instruments of UNESCO. Adopted by the General Conference of UNESCO in 1972, it is ratified in 2021 by 193 countries. 1,121 properties are inscribed on the list in 2021, located in 167 state parties. 1,772 sites are inscribed on the tentative lists in 179 state parties. Paradoxically enough, the increasing number of nominated properties does not, I would say, calm down the desire to be on the list. For a variety of reasons, not always rationally explained, more and more state parties and local decision makers submit every year to the World Heritage Committee the candidacy of a natural, cultural, or mixed property. And we are not discouraged by the considerable cost and the length of the nomination process. How can we explain this success? The enthusiasm for the World Heritage List reveals as much the pride of the recognition as also the hopes of the benefits that such labeling may allow. Increased media coverage, thanks to the place branding, in a way, effect of the UNESCO logo, prestige conferred both by the UNESCO and by the other prestigious and emblematic sites of World Heritage, such as Venice, Machu Picchu, the National Park of the Guangzhou, or the Great Wall in China, but also hope of economic and social development, mainly thanks to the expected development of international tourism. Tourism is indeed one of the most expected impacts of the inscription. This can sometimes result to an excessive exploitation of a site, over-tourism, folklorization, museumification, or extensive construction of tourism venues. At the same time, all submissions to the list must also set out commitments to preserve the outstanding universal value, which is the very justification of World Heritage, by preparing laws, regulations, perimeters, and management tools. State parties and local authorities make efforts to anticipate the effects of increased tourism and also of real estate pressures. So a balance is needed in each World Heritage site between development that various actors, public and private stakeholders, local communities, etc., are expecting, are wishing, and also the sustainable preservation of the site characteristics on which is based the outstanding universal value. World Heritage is as part of a dialogical type of thinking, as defined by French philosopher Edgar Morin. A dialogical relationship exists between preservation and development. Both are necessary, and it is not possible, it is not desirable to choose one of them. So this dialogical relationship between heritage and development makes, of course, site management more complex. My presentation today will focus on the challenges of reconciling heritage and sustainable tourism. More specifically, I will question the role that tourism can play as a factor for local development and also on the necessary conditions that are needed for this. I will focus mainly on the importance of the participation of local communities. Let me pass it to the first part of my presentation and try to explain these multiple and these plural challenges that faces today World Heritage. Though it is often accused still today, World Heritage, to still bear the mark of its European origins, the World Heritage List is evolving towards diversification and pluralization of its categories. The NARA document in 1994, the strategy for a credible list in 1994, and also the work carried out by centers of category 2, such as yours, have all aimed to integrate emerging and plural heritages. Attention is given to post-colonial heritages, to communities, and to their relationship with tangible and more with intangible heritage. The very contours of the World Heritage List have evolved, along with the meaning of the listed heritage, shifting from uniqueness to representativeness. To quote here authors such as Pocock or Christina Cameron. So World Heritage sites are opening up to a plurality, witnessing of human diversity. And while in fact the first inscribed properties represented the most emblematic sites, such as the ones you can see here in this slide, Venice, Florence, or Machu Picchu, the best of the best, as remarked Christina Cameron. I mean, emblematic sites, the absence of whose could ruin the very credibility of the list in the beginning. The properties which are inscribed later raise different questions or convey a plurality of ways of understanding and of defining heritage. So there are very important semantic differences between the messages that convey, for example, sites such as Le Havre which is a French reconstructed city inscribed in 2005, or the industrial landscapes, industrial cultural landscapes, such as the basin, the mining basin in France, or the Blenavon industrial landscape in UK. The ways is expressed the outstanding universal value, this common substance in a way that ensures the unity of the list beyond its diversity, is becoming more and more pluralized. However, the evolutions of the list are not only semantic, they also have an impact, implicit or explicit, on the objectives assigned to the listing itself, giving a more central place to sustainable development issues. International organizations are converging on the role of heritage as an instrument, as a tool for local development. UNESCO endorsed this position between 2010, the action plan adopted in Paraty in Brazil, and 2012, the meeting held in Ouro Preto in February 2012. By establishing explicit links between World Heritage Policy and sustainable development. Sustainable development gains a more central position in World Heritage policies. This, in fact, tends to change the understanding of tourism in World Heritage sites. Tourism, in fact, historically has been perceived as a disruptive element, as a disruptive factor, or as a phenomenon that need to be controlled. Let me remind here that tourism is not very present, in fact, in the first texts setting up the World Heritage Policy. It only appears as one of the threats for World Heritage properties. In the 1972 convention, the term tourism appears only once in Article 11.4, which defines the properties that may appear on the list of World Heritage in danger. And I quote here, only properties forming part of the cultural and natural heritage which are threatened by serious and specific dangers, such as the threat of disappearance due to accelerated deterioration, major public or private works projects, rapid urban and tourist development, destruction due to changes in the use of ownership of the land, etc., may be included in this list. Profound alterations due to unknown causes, abandonment for whatever reason, armed conflict breaking out or threatening to break out, calamities and cataclysms, major fires, earthquakes, landslides, volcanic eruptions, changes in water levels, floods, tidal waves, etc. So you see here how tourism is presented. This approach of tourism as one of the major catastrophes that may threaten World Heritage is in fact regularly reiterated. For example, in a manual published by UNESCO in 2010, the title is Managing Disaster Risk for World Heritage, which in fact recalls those, I quote, gradual and cumulative processes that can impact on heritage properties, such as erosion, mass tourism, drought, or the speed of invasive species. So again, tourism is associated with major other threats. So to make it short, in the 1972 convention, tourism is considered as a possible cause of disasters. And more generally, in fact, in many academic or institutional studies, tourism is discussed in terms of pressure or in terms of over-frequentation, over-visitation. Tourism is mass tourism. So how can we analyze today the association between these three terms? World Heritage, Tourism, and Development. In fact, a new paradigm is gradually emerging, and this is what I would like to discuss today. A new paradigm, which aims to identify sustainable tourism as a tool, as an instrument for the development of World Heritage sites, as a means, in fact, of ensuring their very conservation. And this is a huge change, in fact. So tourism now enters in this dialogical relationship that I mentioned before between development and conservation. In 2012, the World Heritage Committee passed a resolution in favor of a new tourism program adopted in 2012 with a first action plan for 2013-2015. And I quote again here, the World Heritage and Sustainable Tourism Program represents a new approach based on stakeholder dialogue and cooperation, where planning for tourism and heritage management is integrated at the destination level. Natural and cultural assets are valued and protected, and appropriate tourism is developed. We will discuss about what this appropriate tourism is. So my question will be here, what are the challenges and what are also the applications of this new paradigm of sustainable tourism? Well, the development of this new paradigm modifies the terms of the evaluation of the effects of the inscription. It is not only about evaluating the impacts, positive or negative, of tourism on heritage, but also it is about evaluating its impacts on local development by analyzing its beneficiaries and also the local and social recompositions that local development through tourism can bring. The question of the stakeholders and of the beneficiaries of the development induced by tourism becomes more and more central in World Heritage sites. Well, many questions, of course. And one of the main questions is, again, who are the beneficiaries of the development induced by the UNESCO inscription? And more specifically, who, in fact, has the benefit of the tourism development of World Heritage sites? The focus is put more and more on local communities and on the local and also the spatial dimension of development. These concerns, of course, take a more political question, more political dimension when we question more specifically the beneficiaries and the implication of the local communities. Who participates in the choices made in terms of identification, preservation, and enhancement of World Heritage properties? What place should have non-experts, local inhabitants, for example, local communities, for example, in the identification of strategies and definition of policies and projects? How can they be recognized, having capacity to act as actants, in fact, to quote here Harrison? So UNESCO took into consideration these questions through the broad concept of communities. On the proposal of New Zealand, the World Heritage Committee in Christchurch in 2007 added a fifth strategic objective, community, to the four objectives defined by the 2002 Budapest Declaration, means credibility, conservation, capacity building, and communication. This new objective, this new strategic objective, aims at the participation of communities in both the identification and also the management of World Heritage. This fifth strategic objective also invites to recognize the capacity of these communities, the capacity of local communities to act, and the relevance of their contributions to the definition of the modalities of conservation, of enhancement, and of development of heritage. So communities are not longer only objects, but also subjects of development and of sustainable tourism policies linked to the management of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The appropriation of sustainable tourism by the local inhabitants, by the communities, refers also to the dynamics of empowerment, allowing to local communities to construct a representation of themselves while asserting themselves as actors of development. Let me just give you here one example. I could take many others, but I really would like to take here the example of the archaeological park of Saint Augustin in Colombia, listed on the World Heritage List in 1995. The Yanacona community affirmed its position within the indigenous movement also, and in fact, the community reacted to the development restrictions made in the name of the conservation of the park. The community adopted a very strategic way to, to work with development within the archaeological park, and also to assert the place of the community within the park. The Yanacona community claims the right to development, particularly through the development of, for example, transport infrastructures, local transport infrastructures, or also the construction of a site to sell indigenous crafts to visitors. These initiatives, local transportation, this place to sell local crafts, was initially, in fact, refused for conservation reasons. So now the local community was, in fact, opposed to this strict conservation and really brought proposals that could allow them, in fact, to benefit from the inscription on the list. This example illustrates also the sometimes non-consensual dimension of active participation adopted by the community, which may sometimes be also in opposition to public institutions. Obviously, it is important here to take some distances from a kind of romantic and a kind of reified vision that sometimes researchers have about communities. There is not one community in a World Heritage site. Sometimes communities are plural. They're marked by fracture lines. In fact, they are marked by oppositions. And they not already exist in a fixed way, but they are also constructed in the very action of recognizing and, in fact, enhancing heritage. So community integration in tourism and sustainable development policies for World Heritage seems here to introduce a double challenge. To allow first for an open conception of communities, integrating here plural and different individuals with possibly divergent practices and conceptions of heritage and heritage-related issues, and also to consider communities and their members as subjects and not just recipients of the policies carried out. So to imagine the modalities of community participation in sustainable tourism. So let me speak very, very briefly about the communities on World Heritage sites. Well, I spoke already about the relationship between World Heritage sites, and I really would like here to stress on these different, in fact, relationships between World Heritage sites open to tourism or offering tourist products and the communities living within the World Heritage sites or nearby. These relationships, as I mentioned before, are different, multiple, and diverse. In recent years, the local agencies for example, for site planning, development and management, as well as academia, have raised serious questions about these interrelationships, which seem sometimes problematic. The main question here is, again, how to maintain the socio-cultural sustainability of the host communities while sharing the World Heritage Site's cultural assets with tourists. To understand this complex, the complexity of these questions, it is important to take into consideration the fact that first, the socio-cultural mosaic of each community has hosted tourists different, multiple, and also the fact that each community may have its own socio-cultural carrying capacity, or rather its own limits of acceptable change, and also its own attitude concerning World Heritage Sites and World Heritage Site development. Consequently, the reaction of different local communities to the inscription of a site and its operation as a tourist attraction is very different from one site to another. This can lead to potential tensions between the need for standardized planning, development, and management of World Heritage Sites on the one hand, and the need to adapt tourism to the specific local constraints, to the specific local expectations of all groups of the host community on the other hand. What are, and this is another question that I would like to introduce, what are the sustainable solutions? What are the sustainable guidelines to balance, on the one hand, the will to use tourism as a vehicle for tourism development, and on the other hand, to respect and to respond to the needs of the host communities? Means, for example, the protection of their private life, the protection of their quality of life also, the protection of their cultural values. These are very, very important questions, of course, and solutions should be tailored on the specific requirements and constraints of all communities inhabiting within or nearby the World Heritage Sites. Let's discuss now this balance between tourists and local communities. The sustainability of tourism theoretically implies that all tourist attractions are environmentally, socio-culturally, and also economically balanced. However, moving from theory to practice sometimes is extremely difficult. It's a real challenge. In fact, the weakest of the three aspects of sustainability, economy, environment, and social, is usually the social part. Social sustainability is usually the most complex to guarantee. This is mainly due to the difficulty of measuring the expected and real effects of tourism on the host community. We don't always have effective measurement tools. And in the absence of effective measurement instruments, a wide range of management policies have been adopted. Some of these practices ignore the requirements of host communities. Others allow limited community involvement in site planning and development. And only in rare occasions is local planning and tourism development truly community-centered, truly community-centered. When it comes to cultural tourism development, particularly in World Heritage Sites, the social cultural stress on host communities resulting from the lack of community involvement in planning and development processes can become more evident than in some others, eventually heritage sites. In such circumstances, local people make really express their negative attitude towards tourism by claiming, for example, that they are exposed to what we often call the zoo syndrome. The zoo syndrome means the fact that they are being watched, they are being photographed by tourists without, in fact, always their explicit permission. They can also be subject to what they call staged authenticity. Staged authenticity means creating themselves a kind of tourism stage for the pleasure of tourists. So for these reasons, sometimes local communities feel as they are disconnected from their own heritage. And as I said before, this may concern any heritage or any major heritage site, but these trends are exacerbated in World Heritage sites for a number of reasons. Often, host communities live really within the boundaries of World Heritage sites. And this is, for example, the case of the image I showed before with the archaeological park in Angkor, which is a huge World Heritage site in which there is people living there. This is just an example. This is also the case in many natural parks in different areas in the world, in which, in fact, you have people there, and in which some conservation objective be contradictory to local development or local wishes of communities. Also, the fact that sometimes World Heritage sites may represent a different heritage, be it tangible or intangible, from that of the current inhabitants of the site. And it sometimes happens that a local community does not have anymore an organic relationship, an organic connection with the World Heritage site. Also, the fact that World Heritage sites attract people from all over the world. They attract people for a very wide range of cultural backgrounds. And there is sometimes a more important risk of, I would say, deviant behaviors. This can take sometimes particularly problematic dimension, just to quote this movement, which is called naked in monuments, which consists on what you can imagine, and which can be extremely problematic in some sites, and in specifically sites which have a spiritual or a religious dimension. The inscription of a World Heritage site is also based on the definition of outstanding universal value, but sometimes this can be interpreted by host communities as a kind of confiscation of their own understanding of cultural heritage, a kind of confiscation, of their own definition of what heritage is. Also, the marketing of World Heritage sites, which is sometimes aggressive, in some heritage sites quite aggressive, and which is disseminated in media and mainly for marketing purposes, may offend the local population and may force them to act passively or actively against, in fact, tourism, against the tourists. This sometimes results to touristophobia, to touristophobic phenomena. And I will just give here, just as an illustration, the case of Barcelona, in which we do have this very, how can I say, explicit touristophobic phenomena. Let me now speak about the relationship of World Heritage and tourism development, sustainable tourism development. Well, as I mentioned already, host communities and World Heritage tourist sites often share the same spaces. They are in the same spaces. And as I said before, this sometimes can create a potential conflict between these stakeholders, between heritage stakeholders and local communities. However, I must remind again, though it seems obvious, but I must remind again that tourism development in World Heritage sites should maximize the benefits to the communities, should maximize the benefits of the communities while minimizing the negative impacts, the negative socio-cultural, environmental, economic impacts, and also the impacts of their quality of life. So the question that I will introduce here in this part of my presentation is, what kind of objectives should be set for the community in order to satisfy both the objectives of successful tourism development and also the total respect of the community's interests? I will organize this in 4 units. I will speak first about the requirements at the environmental level. This means, and I will pass quite quickly in the presentation of these objectives, this means, first of all, to minimize the negative environmental impacts generated by cultural tourism, by tourism in World Heritage sites. Again, this is easy to say, sometimes complicated to achieve. An important point that I should stress here is that it's important to enable communities to define, excuse me, their own limits of acceptable environmental change. Of course, tourism brings changes, of course, but each community should fix its own acceptable limits of environmental change. Then it is also important to involve local people in planning and managing the environmental impacts, anticipate the impacts, and bring local communities to participate also to the alleviation of these impacts. It is also important to demonstrate to local communities that the development of cultural and cultural tourism in their living space will not only, will not have negative environmental impacts, but can eventually be used as a tool to restore environmental damage already done before the inscription on the World Heritage List. And this is something that seems to me very important to consider, that the process of the inscription on the World Heritage List can be also used as a process that will bring good, positive changes. It is also important to develop proactive policies to ensure that the proportion of the profits that come from tourism in World Heritage sites are invested to the environmental management and to the maintenance of World Heritage properties. So these benefits will also contribute to the restoration of eventual environmental damage. So this is for the first point concerning the environmental level. Let me speak now about the economic impacts. Again, here it's important to integrate communities into the local tourism economy through training, through financial incentives, through business incubators and other tools. We know that the tools exist, so we must use them in a kind of very extensive way. It is also important to create a DMO, a destination management organization, or to affiliate the site with an existing DMO. This contribute to economies of scale. So not only in the perimeter of the World Heritage Site, but also connected to a more important environment in which the World Heritage Site is located. In most cases, a World Heritage Site is not the destination. In most cases, destination is huger. And in this huge destination, you also have the World Heritage Site. So it is very, very important to work on the connection with the huge destination. And this is why it is important to connect with the DMO, with Destination Management Organization. It is also important to distribute tourism businesses opportunities spatially and functionally, to allow as many businesses as possible to benefit economically from the listing on the World Heritage List. And also, it is important to monitor all this, because sometimes things start well, but 5 years, 6 years after the listing or after this new dynamic that comes on a site, thanks to the inscription, things sometimes do not work very well. So monitoring is extremely important. And it is specifically important concerning small businesses. And in fact, in most of heritage sites in general, World Heritage sites also, when we speak about tourism, we speak about very, very small scale businesses. So these small scale businesses sometimes are particularly fragile. This is why monitoring is very, very important. In the social level, which, as I said before, is the most complicated, I believe, one. It is important to ensure at the level of planning and feasibility studies that the outstanding universal value of a World Heritage Site is understood and shared locally. And above all, that this universal outstanding value does not contradict local values, and that in the opposite reinforces local values. And this is something not anecdotal. I mean, this happens often. This happens often, the fact that the outstanding universal value is not always locally understood, is not always locally, really shared. Also, it's important to use the means of conservation and preservation of heritage properties as a lever for cultural revival. And this is also one of the possible effects of the World Heritage listing, which is again a kind of positive process. We can see it as a process that can bring, in fact, more and more positive values in the years before, in the preparation dossier, but also after the inscription. So it's important to think about how can we keep people in place? How can we provide work opportunities for the youngsters? So those are very important questions. And it is also important to use the inscription in order to encourage what I could name as a local patriotism. Local patriotism means the feeling of belonging, the fact that people who live in a World Heritage Site is proud of being part of this World Heritage Site. And also enable all members of the local communities, and again, I speak about communities in the plural, because again, in most cases, we do have different local communities. So important to enable the representation of these local communities at all levels of planning, development, and operation of the World Heritage Site. My fourth point will be on quality of life. And all the images I showed before for these 4 questions, environment, economy, social, and quality of life, I took my pictures of different sites, in different World Heritage sites. And in most pictures, I think most of these pictures is a good illustration or a bad illustration of what I'm trying to say. Here, this image is taken in Budapest, and I think that the contrast between this sign here, which in fact explains that this area is inscribed on the World Heritage List, and the homeless behind is quite explicit. So in terms of quality of life, because here also a lot of things, a lot of positive things can be done, can be achieved thanks to the inscription on the list. Speaking about tourism and the relationship between local development, tourism, and quality of life, which is my presentation today, it's important to use the presence of tourists to create recreational activities, to create leisure and other services, which in fact require a minimum investment threshold precisely provided by the tourist public. So the tourist public in some cases can pay for the locals. And this is something that in several sites can be is achieved and can be quite easily achieved. It is also important to ensure access for local people to recreational, heritage, and tourist facilities, which are sometimes developed as part of the World Heritage development. Also important to ensure local people's access to local transportation systems, and also other services, which are also offered as part of the tourism development. Very important also to minimize all the negative, all the nuisances, all the negative aspects of tourism, means overcrowding, noise, pollution, etc., etc. And pollution is something very important because sometimes if it is not well designed, tourism can be a very polluting also factor. So please keep in mind these four families of requirements, again, environmental, economical, social, and quality of life. And let's now see how can we, in fact, can bring local communities to participate more, in fact, in tourism development, in local tourism development. As I said before, the degree of community involvement in the evolution and functioning of a World Heritage site is often neglected in the planning process. As a result, these questions of community participation are dealt with a posteriori, after the inscription. And this obviously is much more complicated, is much more difficult than if they were dealt before as part of the process. This changes a lot in the last years, of course, but this is quite problematic in World Heritage sites that were inscribed some years ago. In practice, there are at least 3 possible levels of local community involvement. Just ignore local communities, leaving the community out of the process and, in fact, completely ignoring their attitude and their expectations towards tourism development. Second level, inform. So planners or decision makers inform the community about the process, but expect the community not to participate in the planning development or in the management of the site. And not, in fact, to define their own interests in the process. And third level, involve. Involve by listening to the different voices of the communities, or the different interests of the communities, and see the communities as part of the overall process. In terms of the level of centrality of community involvement in the process, there are also 3 possible levels. At a lower level of communities that play only a very minor role in the planning, development, and management of World Heritage sites. A second level, which refers to the communities that play the role of more or less equal stakeholders than other stakeholders, local authorities, public, private stakeholders, etc. And a third level, which in fact communities are clearly represented their level of engagement is really high. Their interests and their expectations are placed at the very center of the process. It is very important to note that the levels of community involvement and the centrality in the process can be also dynamic and can change over time as the World Heritage Site moves from the planning stage to the development stage and reaches finally its operating stage. So this dynamic approach, we need also to keep it in mind. Obviously, in the two examples, in the two categories I took before, it goes, I think, without saying that it is absolutely important to involve local communities and the highest level. How can we do this? I can here suggest a 7 steps process in order to bring the communities to be really part of the development. The first step is to assess the community's willingness to present its culture and to present, in fact, their know-how or local traditions as part of the tourism product. So a feasibility study that should be done at the beginning of the process and should cover all parts of the host community. In a second step, potential conflicts over shared spaces and land use should be also mapped, a good mapping of all the potential conflicts. This is a very crucial step. And this should be considered before the planning phase, in order to ensure that there are not frictions due to conflicting land use, for example, or due to tourism sensitivities that may later trigger conflicts over the tourist and cultural use of the space. In a third step, it is important to do the mapping of all relevant stakeholders to really understand and characterize the interrelationships between these different stakeholders. This step will also help to define to what extent the local communities can be involved, in fact, in the 3 levels of product development of the World Heritage Site. A fourth step corresponds to the assessment of community expectations. This step can determine the extent to which community interests, economic, cultural, and environmental, etc., in the development process can be, in fact, taken into consideration. In a fifth step, it is important to assess the community's willingness to be involved. It is important to see if the local communities really want to be part of the process. And if they don't, to invite them as much as possible to be part. In a sixth step, it is important to establish the development policy by adapting and integrating all the community's interests into a World Heritage plan based on all the assessments of the steps I presented just before. And finally, in a seventh and last step, based in fact on the step 6, means on the establishment of development policy, step number 7 corresponds to the drafting of a detailed plan that outlines all practical aspects of the development and of the planning and operational management of the World Heritage Site. The outcome of this step should be incorporated into the management plan submitted to UNESCO as part of the nomination dossier. And of course, I remind again that all steps are iterative, and it is absolutely important to monitor the development of the different steps. So produce quite often audits should in fact, which should in fact include occasional surveys of community representatives through the process of the implementation. And in fact, the aim of this monitoring, the aim of these surveys is to determine whether the interests, the needs, the limitation also of acceptable change as defined by the local communities are really respected. So this is more or less globally what I would like to say today. Let me now pass to my conclusion. As you may know, we are preparing now the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Community, 50 years after 1972. Almost 10 years ago, the theme of the 40th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention in 2012 was World Heritage and Sustainable Development, the role of local communities. In this book, I put here Benefits Beyond Borders, edited by Amar Gala, a book which was produced for the occasion of the 40th anniversary. No contribution of the several contributions in the book mention tourism. But tourism, when we read the book, tourism is in fact a totally transversal element in, I would say, more or less all local cases examined in this book. And this fits, I think, well with the new paradigm of UNESCO concerning tourism that I presented in the beginning of my lecture. Because in fact, the focus shifts from tourism volumes or tourism behavior to local practices and local policies. Local practices and local policies concerning tourism become really important. In Christchurch in 2007 reiterate the distinction between the near and far, and reiterate, in fact, or redefines the meaning of communities. Communities can have a direct link with associated interests to individual sites, and often this link goes back a long way. These communities share a close proximity to the sites, to the World Heritage site. This means that we can feel part of a community even if we don't live in Venice. We can feel as part of a community of an important World Heritage site, which eventually responds to our sensitivity and responds to our to the love that we can have for the site if we don't live in the site. So communities can be redefined today, and tourism is also today the tool, the means thanks to which a new relationship can be built with World Heritage sites and people coming from everywhere. So what I really would like to introduce here is the fact that, of course, I mainly spoke about local communities. I mainly stressed the importance of taking into consideration local communities. But I would like to integrate, to bring here as an element of community building, the fact that thanks to World Heritage sites, all of us can be part of an imagined community of World Heritage Sites everywhere in the world. And for my last slide, I would like here to take as an example this major site here, which I believe illustrates perfectly the relationship between UNESCO's World Heritage policies and local communities, but also international communities, as I mentioned before. Well, this example is Ayers Rock or Uluru-Kata in Australia. This property was inscribed under the name of Ayers Rock on the UNESCO list in 1987, only as a natural site at that time. However, this is a very important site, which is a very spiritual site for the Aborigines. So the Aborigines mobilized against this symbolic dispossession of their site. And in fact, they succeeded in having its cultural dimension also affirmed. Ayers Rock was renamed as Uluru-Kata, and it was also recognized not only as a natural site, but also as a cultural site. Its outstanding universal value, which was initially defined only as natural, in fact, without any consultation at that time with local community, is now inscribed as both natural and cultural space, cultural site. From two different, in fact, but juxtaposed perspectives that constitute outstanding universal value. And it's very, very important to see how this example illustrates the pluralization of World Heritage Sites. The fact that this universal outstanding value can be also pluriversal. This site illustrates also the more and more accepted pluriversality of the outstanding universal value, the pluriversality of World Heritage Sites. And I think this is a very good example to say what is possible to do and what is not possible to do in terms of tourism in a World Heritage Site. As a natural site, this splendid place here was open, for example, to escalating. This is not possible anymore. The acceptance also of the local values, of the community's values, transform also not only the meaning of the site, but also what it is possible to do touristically. So this is my end point here, and I really would like to thank you very much for your attention and to invite you to ask any question you would like to discuss with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Maria. Thank you for your insightful lecture, and it was really interesting that you addressed the 4 points, 4 objectives, the environmental, economic and social, and quality of life. I think those objectives you've mentioned are really important for the sustainability of World Heritage tourism. Thank you for your insightful lecture. And yes, we are waiting for our public participants' question today, and I would like to talk a little bit more about today's lecture before we start today's Q&A session. And it was really interesting that in 1972 that tourism was considered as a threat at the beginning. And then how about the researchers in the academic part thought about tourism at then? Did they also thought that it was a threat to World Heritage Sites conservation or to World Heritage Sites protection?
Well, this is a very good question. When we look back at academic works in the 1970s and 1980s, first of all, I must say that we do not have so much production, academic production specifically on World Heritage at that time. As you know, World Heritage becomes today a very popular academic topic. We do have a lot of academics specialized on World Heritage. This was not the case in the beginning, and the works on World Heritage are rather, I would say, gray literature, so mainly reports, not that much academic work. And in fact, which is interesting is that these first works come mainly from the conservation side. So from the conservation side, yes, tourism was seen as a threat. And these first works mainly insisted on the danger aspects, on the threatening aspects of tourism on World Heritage sites. With the years passing, we had more and more works by social sciences. And I think this brought a huge change. The fact that more and more anthropologists, social geographers started, in fact, producing on World Heritage. This probably brought a different approach because, in fact, while conservation studies or history of art look mainly on the World Heritage site, on the heritage artifact, social changes look in the relationship that local communities can build with the World Heritage site. So the gaze is not the same. The ones look to the artifact, the others look to, okay, what can we do with the fact that this site is on the list and what can be the benefits? And then we started having voices that in fact complained again the fact that the main focus was put on conservation. And we had in fact a kind of negligence of the importance of benefits for local communities. So yeah, this started quite slowly, and thanks to works of social sciences.
Thank you for your answer, and I also agree with what you said that World Heritage Science researches are still expanding, and researches on World Heritage issue and including the tourism issues are also increasing numbers of researches on those topics. So, and thank you for your answer once again. And maybe we can start our Q&A session now. Here's our first question. Well, the question was, how can we involve the community? Providing financial benefits to the community is an easier option to lead them to the heritage process, especially in the tourism market. What do you think about this one? That was the question.
Thank you for this question. Yeah, of course, I totally agree. This is one of the possible tools of involving local communities. Of course, there are many other possibilities, and I tried to present some of them when I presented the environmental, the economic, the social, and the quality of life issues. So there are many other tools, but this tool specifically is very, very important. Incentives, giving incentives to local firms. As I said before, speaking about tourism and heritage, but mainly tourism today, those businesses are quite fragile. They are small businesses. We don't have huge businesses. We do have, of course, some very, very huge businesses coming mainly through the hospitality sector and mainly through the building, in some cases, of hotels and this kind of tourism infrastructures. But on the World Heritage sites, most of the businesses are medium and small businesses. So yes, they need to be helped in a way. We need incentives, and we need also a very, very good monitoring.
Yeah. In the lecture too, she addressed Maria also addressed the the significance of monitoring those sites. So thank you for your answer. And well, now there's our second question. I will read out the second question. The question was, when natural heritage has a dissonant or conflict history, then what interpretation strategies should we take to present it to show a whole history, but not making it too controversial? Okay, that is a complicated question.
It's an excellent question. And as usually, excellent questions are sometimes complicated, Raj. But thank you for this question. It's really excellent. And this is sometimes the case. We do have some issues, for example, in national parks in Africa mainly, not only, but we had some issues in some national parks in Africa, which are protected today as natural properties, and which in fact stress mainly on a strictly nature conservation aspect. And this, yes, can be dissonant with other cultural values and also the needs of communities that live in these areas. Some research speak about white colonialism in order to explain what happened in some of these natural parks, in which, in fact, the mainly European gaze considered that these natural areas are virgin natural areas, which of course is not the case. There are places in which there are people living there, there are local communities which need, in fact, to live. They need to produce what is necessary for their everyday living. And this, yes, creates tensions, conflicts, and dissonances. I believe that this is more and more understood. We do have more and more discussions, which are very good discussions. The fact that we are speaking about this is not a contestation of the importance of the natural side of the sites. Obviously, these natural sites are extremely important as natural sites. But these discussions are very good because they bring also another way of seeing things. And of course, they bring more complexity, because always it's quite easy. Well, it's easier to protect an enclave. It's easier to protect a place in which you only have to protect nature. But when you have to take into consideration this sometimes opposing interests, the protection, the conservation of a natural site, but also the fact that people there, they need to hunt, they need to cultivate, they need to produce, things become much more complicated. So yeah, interpretation is extremely important. Interpretation is extremely important, but what is the most important, I think, is to reach this understanding of a positive complexity. Consider that the fact that we do have this kind of opposing approaches is not a problem per se. It's something that should be brought in the public arena, should be discussed by academics, by NGOs, by local stakeholders, and in each case, we need to find the best solution.
Thank you for your answer. And this one was not a public question, but I would like to ask, in case of government's aspects, how can the governments, especially governments in charge of managing or in charge of controlling tourism at World Heritage Sites, or even other cultural and heritage and mixed heritage sites, how can they put some effort on involving communities on the tourism, on making a interpretation or presentation plan for tourism on sites?
This is also a very good question. Thank you for this. Local governments can play a major role, really a major role. I think that some of these, the most important decisions concerning local communities' involvement come or may come or should come from local governments. They are really the more central stakeholders for this. And again, this is about planning, this is about strategy, and this is about the tourism, which today, I would say everywhere, but a fortiori on World Heritage Sites, should be planned, organized, and regulated. And this is very, very important. The problems we do have in some mass tourism areas is because precisely of lack of planning. We sometimes tend to consider that the tourism is a kind of natural phenomenon that comes to this place or goes to the other place. But this is obviously not the case. We cannot accept anymore these laissez-faire strategies for tourism. Tourism needs regulation, and one of the most important parts of the regulation of tourism is really to organize the ways of bringing together the main stakeholders. And clearly, local communities make part of the main stakeholders. So I think this is really crucial, and local governments can play a major role. Different tools exist today. We spoke before about incentives, but it's very important, as I mentioned before in my presentation, to bring the local communities from the beginning of the process, because obviously their participation in the beginning will probably change the nature of the tourist development. A posteriori, in a planned tourist development that, will be brought to them in a kind of forced way. So early association, real association, truly, and sincere association from the beginning.
Thank you for your answer. And there's another question here. Well, the next question was, there are certain aspects of heritage sites that appeal to majority of tourists internationally, such as spectacular views and popular photo zones, and that people share online. How can other values and interpretation be practically accepted and implemented by the tourism industry? Okay, that was the question.
Thank you. It's also a very interesting question, because it really stresses the huge important role that play today social media. And this is something that comes, in fact, in the last years. This is a kind of relatively new trend. This started, 10 years ago, mainly through the social media. And of course, the idea is not only to visit Angkor. The idea is to be on the specific temple, which is the place to be for the sunshine or for the sunrise. And we know how it works. You have specific products that bring masses of tourists on a site specifically for the sunrise. I will never forget the feeling I had the first time I went in Angkor. I was invited, in fact, to the sunrise at 5 o'clock in the morning. And I had the feeling that this would be a very exclusive experience. And I was so surprised to see that when I arrived in the site, there were hundreds, thousands of people at 5 o'clock in the morning waiting for this sunrise. And this comes, of course, because people is wanting the image in their smartphone, but also because the industry proposes, in fact, this very conventional, in a way, this very mass tourism product. So I don't know how to tell you the truth to this question. I think that this really relates a lot both to tourism behavior and to industry attitude. So I would expect from the industry to really suggest more of the beaten tracks approaches, more original experiences to the tourists. But they would also expect from the tourists to not really follow exactly these trends or these places to be only for the sake of sharing this on Instagram or Facebook. Mm-hmm. But we have a lot of things to learn, I think, as tourists ourselves.
Yeah, really. We have lots of things to learn as tourists, not only as researchers or people as heritage professionals or experts. There are a lot of things we can still learn as a person of a public. So thank you for your answer. And I think that is all for today's Q&A session. And before we end up today's lecture, would you like to say something to our public participants today?
Just to thank you for your attention. It's always complicated when we give a lecture online. We don't have the possibility of a physical contact, and I really hope that we will have in the future the opportunity to see each other in another context, a conference, a lecture, a colloquium, a symposium, somewhere in the world. You do have my contacts, and if you need to contact me for a specific question, please do not hesitate. I would be really happy to answer. And I would like also to take this opportunity to thank again the organizers for this invitation. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak about my research and my questions concerning work.
It was our honor to have you. Thank you for your answer, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and opinions, and also sharing your email address with our public participants. Well, even though I know we are going to round up today's lecture, well, actually there was another question coming up today. Maybe we can end up with answering this question now. Will it be okay? Great, thank you. Well, I will read it out loudly. The last question is, what if local communities live nearby World Heritage Sites has negative feeling about World Heritage Sites OUV? Yeah, that was...
Again, I really admire the questions. They're all of them excellent. Well, yes, as I mentioned before, this can be the case. This is the case. This should not be the case. This should not be the case because, and this is less and less the case. I mean, this concerns mainly sites that were inscribed several years ago. I think that today is absolutely clear that the site, before being inscribed on the list, there is this preparatory work with the local community. So hopefully we will not have anymore any feelings of reject by local communities today. But this is the case of sites that were inscribed a few years ago. And for the reasons I mentioned before, means that this inscription was done without associating the local community. So it's always very complicated, it's very difficult to do this work a posteriori. And in fact, local communities, what do they see? They see that, okay, there is tourism, there are benefits. They see that those benefits are captured by some tourism stakeholders that some of them are not part of the local community. They can be international venues or international groups. They see that the inscription on the World Heritage List brings restrictions. They cannot live as they used to live. They cannot, in fact, restore their house. They cannot, in fact, enhance their quality of life because there are restrictions that come from the listing on the World Heritage List. They cannot sell their products because this is not allowed in the perimeter of the World Heritage Site. They cannot create a garden or build an extension of their house. So all those issues are extremely important, and they should be dealt even a posteriori in communities in which these problems exist. When a community see that, for example, in a site, and I'm here, I will not quote the the names of the sites, but I do have specific sites on mind. When we see that in order, for example, to create a huge esplanade in front of a site, we tear down the houses in which the local communities live, how can we expect that this can be understood by the local communities? How can we expect that the local communities can understand that this happens for the sake of an outstanding universal value that they do not understand? So I don't contest the fact that sometimes expropriations are needed. They can be needed. But this means that there is a very strong and very well-designed local policy that compensates the local inhabitants for all these negative impacts, in fact, of the institution.
Well, thank you for your answer for our last question. And Once again, I and our public participants will really genuinely thankful for your insightful lecture. We really appreciate for joining the online lecture series today. Thank you for your lecture. And before we end today's event, I would like to give a brief introduction to our next lecture. Well, the next lecture, Heritage Interpretation, Digital Media and the End Users with Dr. Hafizur Rahman, will be held on 15 July. It will be held at 8 a.m. CET and 3 p.m. KST. Please check the Facebook and Instagram page of the Preparatory Office for further information on the online lecture series. Thanks again for joining us today, and I hope to see you all at the next lecture. Au revoir.